Good afternoon. Thank you for joining today's Georgia Smart webinar. I'm Greg McCormick, Director of the Georgia Smart Communities Challenge. We're pleased to have Professor Ellen Dunham-Jones from the Georgia Tech School of Architecture with us today. She's the research partner for the City of Chamblee, who is one of 4 grantees of the inaugural Georgia Smart Communities Challenge in 2018. Chamblee's project is focused on autonomous vehicles and the shuttle service connecting the community to public transit. Today's webinar topic is autonomous vehicles and their impact in our communities, with the title of today's talk being Heaven or Hell, Smart Cities and Autonomous Vehicles. Welcome, Professor.
So my name's Ellen Dunham-Jones, and we're still getting a lot of background noise. We're going to just start again with saying that with autonomous vehicles, what is really important is that it's not only the autonomy of the vehicles that's changing. Cars and trucks, buses are really going through 3 revolutions: electrification, automation, and sharing. So the electrification is already well underway and has a great impact on our cities and communities. There's the chance that now you begin to reduce noise, reduce local pollutants. You make urban living much, much more attractive. Automation, which has everybody really excited, is also being introduced gradually. There are 5 levels of autonomy. Levels 1 through 3 are already quite common. Most cars nowadays have cruise control, some degree of automatic braking, some degree of automatic parking. Google is already going that next step to level 4. Google's spin-off company, Alphabet, which spun off Waymo, announced on October 1 this year that they will be launching a minivan taxi fleet without anyone in the driver's seat in Phoenix by the end of 2018. So they will have remote oversight that can take over in case of an emergency. But this is so automation again. It's coming. It's already it's just constantly advancing with new technologies every day, and it really increases the safety of driving. And it also obviously increases the luxury now of free time in the vehicle to do other things than pay attention to the driving. Automation is also, I think, generating a lot of interest as IT companies and car companies kind of get together to plan autonomous vehicle taxi fleets, like the one that's going to be demoed in Phoenix, shuttle buses, various kinds of micro-mobility services that collectively could significantly reduce private car ownership and increase affordability. So that has the potential to be something really pretty dramatic. Now, sharing is the 3rd revolution, and really is going to be key to kind of what the impact of autonomous vehicles really are on our cities and communities. Lyft, Uber, and Chariot have already demonstrated the popularity of sharing rides on reliable, on-demand mobility services. I want to just once again remind everyone and ask them, please mute your microphones if you haven't already. We're still getting a little bit of background noise. Thank you. The sharing is really what is going to make the difference between dramatically reducing traffic congestion or potentially really significantly increasing it, because we now will have the opportunity. We could end up having a lot more 0-passenger trips going around if I just swap out my regular car for an autonomous vehicle, and I tell the car, take me to work, and then I don't want to pay for parking, so I tell the car to go back home. Suddenly that one trip just became 2, and that has a lot of people very nervous about what the impact on congestion will be. On the other hand, if we really see a lot more of the taxi fleets, the shuttle buses, if we see a lot, it could mean we have a lot fewer people needing to own a private car, and we begin to see dramatic decreases in congestion. So these three revolutions, there's a book by Professor Dan Sperling out from UC Davis, California, on this title. These three revolutions are collectively have a lot of potential to change. And as I think, as we're all beginning to realize, I mean, like it or not, AVs are already here. Now, this slide is already out of date. I can't keep up with all of the constant string of announcements of what's going to open, who's competing, and there's a lot of hype as all of the companies are trying to be first to market with their different technologies. But the bigger issue for me is, while there's this race to be the first in the market, what about the planning for their impact on communities? We're playing catch up. There are certainly things like the Georgia Smart Community Challenge, but certainly there aren't that many communities that really have begun to envision what do they want the impact of autonomous vehicles to be on their communities, and so what kinds of policies and planning do they need to put in place? Just a couple of the kinds of things that there's quite a lot of discussion beginning to bubble up is, what's going to the impact? If you just look at commercial real estate, number one, the impact potential on parking is tremendous. Today, most cars are really only used 5%, 6% of the day. 95% of the time, those cars are sitting parked. And we have about 8 parking spaces per car in this country, spread out all around. The assumption is that with autonomous vehicles, suddenly one vehicle can be taking people all around, managing all sorts of trips, and we will have a glut of excess parking lots, decks, and garages ready to be redeveloped or regreened. That could be a tremendous boon for communities. We'll probably, and we already are starting to see, more and more decoupling or elimination of parking from new buildings, changing the typical lot and block sizes, uses for mid-block conditions. I mean, once a building isn't immediately linked to how much parking it needs, it really up a lot of new ways to think about the design of our neighborhoods. Gas stations are another sort of easy pickings of what already there's been a tremendous drop in the number of gas stations. Instead, we're going to see much more need for battery recharging, opportunities for corner sites to become pickup, drop-off, mobility, and neighborhood hubs. Again, when one can imagine a lot of functions that begin to kind of come together at those key sites. A lot of communities are also getting more and more worried about the very wonky sounding curb management. As the expectation is we're going to see less on-street parking and more sort of pickup drop-off at the curbs, more deliveries, but they're going to have to be probably mostly at night. We're going to see a lot more linking of those transit stations and pickup drop-offs with bike and scooter parking and electric skateboards and every other form of micro-mobility that is pretty rapidly expanding. It's going to be in cities' interests to replace the lost parking meter revenue and really increase multimodal access. Just wanted to say, and it may just mean that we begin to rethink how we manage our land use. Single-use zoning might actually, and this is now quite a long-term projection, but it might just not make much sense anymore if cars, trucks, and buses become safer and less noxious, if 3D printing and robotics make manufacturing less noxious, if single-use retail continues to evolve towards mixed-use nodes, as we've been seeing an awful lot of vacant strip malls and malls, but a more reviving of the main streets. There's an opportunity. We're going to, if we continue to see retail seeking out areas where where it's part of a social and physical experience that better competes with online shopping, we may, and if these shared autonomous vehicles really can reduce car ownership, single-use zoning may really shift. So this is all sort of setting up for just a little bit of big picture thinking. Where might all this go? So back to the vehicles themselves. I mean, there's the obvious benefits of autonomous vehicles, and saving time, reducing driver stress, reducing accidents, safer journeys. As an urban designer, and what interests me is also reduced lane widths and all that reduction in the parking space. Autonomous vehicles can drive super efficiently. A typical highway lane is 14 feet wide. We could probably get those down to 7 feet, cut them in half. For cars, they'd have to be a little wider, some of them for trucks and buses. Great benefits to the non-drivers, the elderly, the young, the disabled would have opportunities for mobility. And there's different studies come up with pretty wildly different estimates. Nobody really knows how much autonomous vehicles will reduce costs, but the expectation is that they certainly will reduce the cost of driving. Some of that due to electrification, some of that just due to being lighter vehicles. They won't need, the sensors are complicated, but everything else gets to get a lot simpler. There's also different studies on municipal revenues. Yes, there will be laws. You won't have as many traffic tickets and parking meter revenue and things like that, but you also won't have as many accidents and need as many emergency vehicle folks. So there are expectations. One recent study really expected a significant increase in municipal revenues. Probably the biggest benefit is the expectation that we will reduce the number of privately owned cars. The assumption kind of being that if the average household will be able to reduce from 2 cars to 1, more or less, because an AV can replace, can do a lot more daisy chaining. So somebody has their video on, and if they could please turn off their video cameras. Thanks. But despite all those benefits, there are also costs. There's a lot of very legitimate concern about the massive loss of jobs for truck drivers, for taxi drivers, for in the insurance industry. I mean, there's a lot of industries that will be affected by this. The technological vulnerabilities. There are ethical dilemmas. Who gets to decide if the vehicle has to make a choice between protecting its occupants or hitting a pedestrian? How are we going to set that up? Right now, the assumption is when you purchase the car, you tell it your choice. It's still your, but a lot of ethical discussion needed for some of those issues. And certainly the big costs is the fear that these will simply, by making mobility so much simpler, it will induce more demand, leading to doubling of congestion and vehicle miles traveled, and potentially real decreases in the use of transit as we currently know it. There's also a lot of concern that this will just exacerbate urban sprawl. if you can spend your commute sleeping, watching cat videos, or doing work, why not? What's the difference whether your commute is 30 minutes or an hour or more? So those are very, very legitimate concerns. So, the vehicles themselves are coming in a wide range. I mean, at the bottom here, there's the Google car. There are some pretty fanciful models out there of a car that also becomes a flying quadcopter. They're being tested in Dubai to actually fly from the top roof deck of a parking garage to another roof deck of a parking garage. And these ideas are out there. They're being worked on. But then up at the top are a couple of the different, just two of the different shuttle buses, one as a passenger that's operating right now in an office park in California at Bishop Ranch, and another that is more of a delivery prototype of these. So lots of different versions of these. But before you really get kind of excited about, well, gee, what kind of autonomous vehicle do we want? I think, the key question is not how can your community hop on the bandwagon to welcome or resist AVs. The key question is what kind of future does your community desire, and how might you leverage AVs to achieve that vision? So Tim Keene, the planning commissioner of Atlanta, asked me really to have my students focus on pretty much exactly that question. So 2 years ago, he asked me to lead my students in producing a 25-year vision for downtown Atlanta. And what he was mostly interested in is downtown has small blocks, it should be super walkable, but it isn't. And what should be the A street grid of the most pedestrian-friendly, really walkable, great streets? That was his question. Then I said, well, all right, as long as we're looking 25 years, I want to ask, how do we use those autonomous vehicles to achieve the vision? So it's much more about really where do you want to go, and how do we use the autonomous vehicles? So I found this image of downtown Atlanta that was published in 1910 with a 100-year vision of downtown Atlanta for 2010, and then I threw in the Google car. We seem to have a hard time. I wish we were still as visionary as they were back in 1910 to try to imagine 100 years. It was hard enough to just look 25 years. So very quickly, we started by just trying to understand how the topography, how the railroads influenced the mishmash grid of streets that makes up downtown Atlanta. We looked at the parking. Downtown Atlanta in the core area has 95,000 parking spaces and only 5,500 residents. It really tells you a lot about it. This is mostly a daytime working population, and the streets are really designed, as most of them are one-way streets designed to get commuters in and out of their parking onto the freeways, the highways, as quickly as possible. They're not designed, the system isn't really, the streets and the parking aren't designed to make it a particularly livable place, and that's why there aren't so many residents. So we came up with our sort of the yellow bits in here are the street segments that actually were quite walkable, and then we proposed connecting them up with the red to kind of say, here are the streets that really should be the priority pedestrian-oriented streets. And then we started looking at how could we leverage autonomous vehicles? We developed a few scenarios that, all right, what if we assume that in 25 years, most of the privately owned driven cars are swapped out as privately owned AVs, yeah, we're going to see a lot more sprawl. We're going to see some platooning on highways that could increase capacity, but we're going to basically just see a lot more congestion. The shared scenario, then we sort of also, we looked at ways in which people might send their cars out to be taxis during the day. And we ultimately chose to sort of imagine that in 25 years, we're going to have both autonomous vehicles, privately owned driven vehicles. They're going to be sharing the roads, and we have to kind of plan for both of all of these things. And we're going to have a combination of shuttle buses and some robo-taxi fleets, but also still have some driven cars. Then we made 3 assumptions. The first assumption was that autonomous bus would take over the proposed streetcar route, but with a high-frequency dedicated lane. The autonomous buses, I'm going to talk a lot more about that in a couple of minutes, but there's a reason why we think the autonomous buses we think you can increase frequency and reduce cost as opposed versus a streetcar. The second assumption we made was that driven cars will continue to need half of the current parking spaces, but that with growth in AVs and autonomous rapid transit, which would be autonomous little shuttle buses, would result in a 70 to 90% reduction in overall parking. So we said all new buildings will not require parking. We have plenty. The downtown has more than enough parking. The third assumption was that lane widths will shrink and speed limits will not exceed 20 miles per hour in downtown except on the highway. There's a saying, 20 is plenty. If a pedestrian is hit by a car going 22 miles an hour, chances are the pedestrian lives. 23 miles an hour, no, they don't. Autonomous vehicles follow the speed limit, so we really need any places that we want to be vibrant, lively, have a great street life, streetscape. We should never have speed limits more than 20 miles an hour. So, but by shrinking those lane widths for it within the right-of-way, that gives us more space for sidewalks, bike lanes, and dedicated lanes for shuttle buses. So then we did a whole lot. This is just a couple samples, but we did a whole lot of studies looking at how do you modify the streets to have enough of that pickup drop-off space. Do you put the shuttle bus, do you put it in the middle? Do you what happens to the parking? And really finding a lot of interesting and I think very attractive options out there. Then the students formed teams and worked on 4 different neighborhoods that are currently characterized by an excess amount of surface parking, and just sort of looked at like, okay, if we're assuming that new building, that we've got enough existing parking, that if households only need half as much as they used to need, and especially in downtown where you also have transit, that you just won't need that much parking. What are some different kinds of neighborhoods, and how could you attract more people to want to live in downtown? So one neighborhood focused more on making the streets safer, more pleasant to walk on, while also being an eco-district. Others looked at the parks, others looked at transit and bikes, others at arts. So this one was an eco-district, taking advantage of some very steep hills to recycle water, to produce urban farming demonstrations, and better connectivity with the shared autonomous vehicles. This one looked at bicycle-oriented development. How could you really leverage the increasing amount of bicycle network and attract that growing portion of the population that really like being able to bike to more places and still also have some of that transit. And then another one right at the 5 Points station, the most transit accessible site. They were really intensifying densification and transit on the same site. And then finally, one that was more of an arts district, bringing more affordable housing into smaller infill sites, and then building still up some higher density projects, but by all of it really by building on top of parking lots and vacant sites, reducing crime by imagining that the autonomous vehicles also become the sort of new eyes on the street. They're literally filming, and observing everything around, and could help to transform a neighborhood that currently does not see much development because of fears of crime. Then that, and again, looking at once you start imagining buildings that are not having to require so much parking, the middle of the block can become places for much more landscape, more farming, more ecosystem services, all sorts of different kinds of things. You start to see how do you integrate the buildings more with the autonomous shuttle bus system instead of really with parking. So, and you end up really that with a downtown that one imagines would have safer, slower, quieter streets. The streets would go on road diets. They would have narrower lanes, much more pedestrian space. You'd reduce the amount of parking areas, and you'd have much more frequent shuttle buses and bus service. So it's a real opportunity to raise the bar on the quality and experience of downtown Atlanta. Then all the buildings in blue are the buildings that the students projected. The added capacity really ended up that by building on just half of downtown surface lots, we could add about 60,000 new residents by 2041 without any new parking. That actually seems unbelievable, but it's the rate of growth of Midtown Atlanta over its recent boom period. So we actually think it's fairly feasible. So again, can the reduction of parking and increased walkability encourage more people to use shared AVs and transit? Can we leverage AVs to help us achieve a vision that we want? I mean, if we may, the answer is not definitely yes, but if we at least plan for where we want to go, we've got a much better chance of getting there. Now, on the other hand, so that's, in downtowns, in denser places, there's, I think, a lot of potential upside for autonomous vehicles. In the lower density areas, in the suburbs, it's not so clear. There are some interesting visions out there. I worry in many respects. Many of you, I hope, remember the movie Wall-E, where the Buy Low Corporation pacified humans with hovercrafts and cup holders, and the idea was we're just one company kind of monopolizes everything and just keeps you in transit purchasing things. That scenario is potentially possible. It's a very scary scenario, but I worry about some of the suburbs that already are seeing the suburbanization of poverty. They're seeing declining tax base. The potential of corporations buying the streets so as to maintain the infrastructure could lead us to the sort of dystopic Wall-E future. Another option is much greener option is that has been proposed, that autonomous vehicles will allow us to build leave all the existing cities and suburbs behind and just sprawl further out, but with solar suburbs and drones and a lot of greenery and everything is digital. Digital meets green in a more in what's seemingly supposedly a more eco version. I worry about both of those. I think we need to really think about and strategize how do we build shared mobility strategies that will work in lower density areas. And this is really kind of how I'm getting a little bit more now to the work that we're starting in Chambly. And I think some of the keys to this are encouraging more shared rides, maintaining absolutely public ownership of the streets, and nobody likes to have to pay for it, but a willingness to toll their usage. With autonomous vehicles, we will know every inch that a vehicle travels, and we really could just simply, it's a pay-as-you-go system, and that solo passenger rides or even zero passenger rides get tolled at a much higher level. And that would be one way of both paying for the infrastructure that is going to be needed for these vehicles, and a way to also incentivize some of that sharing. So that's sort of the stick, but on the carrot side, I think there's a lot of interesting opportunities to begin to enhance the experience of sharing. And we have a younger generation that actually really likes to share. So can we design better bus stops? Can we make waiting a more social, productive, and enjoyable system? Enjoyable experience. So some of the project that Zach Lancaster, a PhD student who's working with me, and I are working on for Chambly is to develop a best practices manual for shared autonomous shuttle buses, really. And really trying to redesign user experience. The user experience, and so what I find really exciting about the shuttle buses is that it's potentially a game changer for transit. They have a real cost advantage. As this slide shows, today an SAV, a shared autonomous vehicle, is estimated to be 70% cheaper to operate than a regular bus. That's really the cost. That 70% is the operating cost that goes to the salary of the bus driver. So instead of one driver driving a big bus that comes every 30 minutes, the system could operate 3 smaller shuttles that come every 10 minutes. And that is the game changer for the convenience of really helping people decide to use transit instead of travel on their own. They have a time advantage. The shuttle buses are already market ready. If they're just going on the same route back and forth, they don't have to require anywhere near the amount of machine learning that private autonomous cars need to be able to drive anywhere. So there are 41 shuttle bus pilot projects in the world today. We have 4 coming to the Metro Atlanta area, on North Ave, the Georgia Tech campus, Chambly, and Peachtree Corners. And these are already here. The first SAV on a U.S. public street is in downtown Las Vegas, where they've been operating since January 2017. And there's lots and lots of different autonomous shuttle bus companies. Local Motors makes Ollie, which they 3D print, which I think is sort of fascinating. Supposedly in 10 hours, they can make you one. And the potential impact of this really does get interesting. Just last weekend, New York Times business section on the front page had an article, Urban Planning Guru says driverless cars won't fix congestion, but driverless shuttle buses will. Peter Calthorpe just did a study proposing that if El Camino Real, which is a 45-mile street from San Francisco to San Jose. It's a big, basically a suburban arterial. Mostly currently it's lined with a lot of strip malls and fairly low-rise, very automobile-oriented properties. He says, do two things. Just change the commercial zoning to allow higher density housing and install, instead of SAV, he uses the term ART, autonomous rapid transit, in dedicated lanes on El Camino Real. This could lead to the redevelopment of those aging strip malls and that are kind of dying out anyway, to accommodate more than 250,000 housing units with residents who could live without a car. And certainly San Francisco really needs that. Lots of communities could really benefit from that kind of thinking. So the SAVs could be this real game changer against, for transit, helping people shift to transit. But can they really compete once the private AVs really do hit the market? So the SAVs have a head start, but the private AVs are going to be marketed as living rooms on wheels. This image shows, it's just a concept car, but Renault's Symbioz, which you literally drive the car into your house, you open the doors, and it is your living room sofa. I don't think that many people are really going to go for that, but Volvo's 360C, shown in the lower right there, does have a bed, which, it's going to be hard to compete with. Now, Chambly they've already done a feasibility study for an autonomous shuttle bus, the pilot program that would connect their MARTA rail station with Assembly, a 100-acre mixed-use redevelopment that will be quite intensively redeveloped and includes a new big film studio called Third Rail. So the feasibility study is already in place. We are now advancing that. And in particular, the work that Zach and I are doing is really looking at that user experience. And we think the challenge, because we want to see SAVs really help us reduce congestion and increase mobility. But we've got to overcome two stigmas. First off, there's a stigma to buses, sadly, but the user experience associated with buses ranges from dehumanizing and frustrating. There's an annual contest of what's the sorriest bus stop shown there, and pretty bad. And in addition, we're seeing that the SAVs are boring. Here's this exciting new technology, but so far they really average only going about 10, 12 miles an hour. They're so far only operating in very car-oriented contexts, mostly office parks, and most of the people who go and review them, and they're excited, I'm riding in an autonomous vehicle, and they come back and they say, these are really boring. And I'm worried that I think a lot of people will want to use them once for the novelty, to say I did it. We've got to figure out how to make the experience of getting to them, waiting for them, and riding in them a better experience so that we can really sustain ridership. So one question we're asking is, can we learn from scooters? Atlanta has been invaded by the Birds and the Lime scooters. They're incredibly fun. In an extremely short period of time, they have really taken over, but they're also extremely dangerous. But they go 25 to 30 miles an hour, much faster than an AV shuttle. They are actually targeting the same audience and the same sort of first mile, last mile distance that the AV shuttles are. So we need to sort of figure out, they have limitations, but what can we learn from scooters? So can we make the SAV user experience more fun? At the urban design level, there's all sorts of strategies to improve walkability, bikeability, scooterability to those station stops, to make it that a pleasant experience. I can accomplish some errands on my way. I want to make that part of my journey every day. We have to start thinking about how do we make waiting something that is actually enjoyable while you're at the mobility hub, the bus stop. One of my favorites, the middle slides here, is this art installation of swings that people can just swing while they're waiting at the bus. And they happen to play music. If everyone is in sync, they light up. They're really great. And there's potentials with the app itself to begin to provide opportunities for social interaction with people while waiting at the stop, or choosing not to, if you want. We also need to figure out how to make the SAV user experience more useful. And again, at the urban scale, that means expanding the single pilots into much larger networks and fleets that can go many more places. Our research finds so far that current U.S. projects average 1.5 miles. Just not very far. They carry about 9 people at a time, 6,000 to 9,000 passengers so far per project, at an average cost of $721,000 per mile. So, these are just pilots. We're still figuring all this out, but we need to figure out how to really make the system go many more places so that it's much more useful. And we need to get people to be able to integrate the scooters, the bikes, to get to the AVs in really easy, fun ways. And then we need to expand the destinations that are around those places, and that's where I think, again, tremendous opportunities to redevelop parking lots and parking decks near these stations, encourage ground floor uses that are much more interest to users. We need to figure out how to make the whole experience more sustainable. So can we generate power locally, whether it's with PVs or wind turbines or geothermal? Can the buses themselves become part of the storage system? I mean, this is where the electrification provides a lot of really interesting opportunities. And obviously then being able to power our devices. Can we make the SAVs more competitive? Especially competitive against privately driven private cars. So first step on that is providing dedicated lanes, so that the SAV really does have an advantage. Provide connectivity with traffic signals so that they're, again, given priority. Can we make the user experience more diverse? I mean, right now there's an assumption sort of that a bus system, every bus in your bus system is identical. There's already such diversity in the types, whether it's much longer autonomous trams like the one at the top there, whether it's a little shuttle bus, little school bus that is operating right now down in Babcock Ranch in Florida, or the more beachy version that is being designed for seaside community. So there's opportunities to really vary the sizes of the vehicles, the way they orient to different audiences, and help to become part of a brand, of a community. And certainly, of course, we need to make the SAV user experience safer. And I think there's all sorts of ways, again, that we can make much better designed bus stops that are safer to wait in, but that also make the neighborhoods around them safer. So that's really kind of where we are. We're just really still very early in our research, and look forward to getting more of this sort of written up and produced over the spring and summer. but would welcome a few questions and would be interested, if you can use the chat area to ask questions if you haven't already. And I've just put a little information on the side here. I always love to engage my graduate students with real communities and helping them to figure out sort of what their visions for the future are. So if you're interested in potentially sponsoring a studio, let me know. And here's the URL for that report I did on downtown Atlanta. So let's see, we do have a couple of questions. So the first one is, given the diversity of cities in Georgia, are you aware of any studies that examine the costs and benefits of AVs based on the population, density, and size, geography, and or population of cities? I'm not aware of a study that lays it out in exactly the kind of matrix that you're proposing, mostly because almost all of these pilots, they average 1.5 miles. They're just small segments of the cities. They're not, so most of them are in office parks worldwide. You can talk about there are certainly trends that we see, but they're not yet serving a large enough population that it's really fair to even to quite yet compare to really quite compare, sort of what the population. You can look at the density certainly of that 1.5 mile stretch, and we are documenting some of that, but it's not yet really related to the diversity of all the cities. I hope that makes sense. And this second question, I'm asked to comment on. We're not ready for autonomous vehicles now. There are issues in infrastructure and cybersecurity. So that's getting back to, I know at the very beginning, I'm not sure how many of you could hear me, but when I said my expertise is in the urban design, not in the technology and the vehicle design. So I agree with you. There are certainly issues in cybersecurity. There are a lot of technical challenges that that a lot of money is being put into figuring out. But I think that the infrastructure questions are less of an issue. The biggest questions right now tend to be, how do it's one thing for them to operate in Phoenix, but it's another thing for them to operate in snow and ice. There's also actually a lot of demonstrations going on in Michigan as well as in Phoenix. So it's not only, I agree. There's a lot of technical challenges out there, but there's so much work being done on them that I don't think all these companies would be putting as much money in if they weren't pretty confident that they were going to be able to solve them. So that's sort of my answer on that one. So, all right, the next question. What are your mechanisms for community input when planning for AVs? Would you recommend including community engagement and outreach in best practices? And if so, how? I would absolutely always recommend community engagement as a best practice in any kind of planning. And I think with AVs, it is interesting that, I think right now the easy place to start is with is asking people to think about how they've reacted to Uber and Lyft and some of the other car sharing, car hailing services. Since those are already around and people have some experience with those, it helps. That I think is a helpful way to really start a conversation about kind of imagining the larger AVs. So here's another one. What are some policies which can be implemented to ensure that AVs supplement public transit rather than taking away its ridership? Great question. And I think, again, I'll sort of point to the kind of interesting strategies that Uber and Lyft and the scooter companies now, many of them have set up subscription services with transit. This is certainly here in MARTA, in Atlanta, with MARTA and Lyft have had quite a long history now of developing their subscription services, where a lot of these technologies, I think, are really useful at providing that first last mile that helps transit significantly. As far as, really ensuring that they don't take away from ridership, that's the tougher one. And I think a lot of different communities are sort of trying to figure out some different strategies, because there's probably going to be very different, different impacts on different kinds of service. Some of the mobility on demand, the paratransit kinds of things are already, there's a lot of, I think, opportunity for AVs to actually really help with that, especially with just the interfaces and all. And in general, I think the most important thing is that we're seeing a lot of transit agencies themselves saying, okay, we're a transit agency, we're getting in the business of AVs. And so they're not so much fighting it as really adopting it and transforming into it. So let's see, another one. Every county in Georgia has a share transit system, the school bus system. I totally agree. I've often actually told a lot of sort of communities when I say, do you have transit? And they say no. And I say, you have school buses? Yes, that's transit. So the question continues. Getting students to use SAVs will make it a common thing as they enter the workplace and ease acceptance. What is the state of the art and application today? So, well, it is interesting. So I did show the slide of actually a little school bus autonomous shuttle that is operating in Babcock Ranch in Florida. Babcock Ranch is a very large master planned community that from the get-go has been master planned for autonomous vehicles and with a whole shuttle bus system. But just about 2 weeks ago, they were actually told not to halt using the school bus because they felt they couldn't guarantee that the safety was really there, and there were concerns. And that's all I don't know any more details than that. But so in the U.S. though, Babcock Ranch, I think, is really has kind of gotten the furthest on that. In worldwide, Singapore is really the state of the art on the autonomous vehicles kind of right now. They're doing, they seem to be sort of furthest ahead, especially in some of the battery storage issues and things. But in Tokyo is kind of doing, there's a lot of different things going on in different cities. Scandinavia, Helsinki, and Oslo are also kind of come to mind of doing some innovative things. So we still have a lot of catching up to do. But I agree with you. I think the school bus system would be a really great kind of way to kickstart some of this. Okay, last question. What are your thoughts about the growth of e-commerce and the impacts on communities, which will need to accommodate more warehouses everywhere to make same-day deliveries work and delivery vehicles on our streets? That's a great question as well, and I think one that I speculate quite a bit about. because so a lot of the discussion of deliveries relative to autonomous vehicles occurs at a couple different scales. There's a lot of talk about drones, literally airdropping stuff on your porch. There's talk about little wheeled, almost like shopping cart size kind of wagons that would just go scooting along neighborhood streets, neighborhood sidewalks to get to your home. Everybody's trying to avoid just having a whole bunch of UPS trucks driving around, but the assumption is that a lot of sort of freight delivery will increasingly occur at night. A lot of deliveries, commercial delivery, will also increasingly occur at night. Because it can be automated now, and again, you're not having drivers, you can time things quite differently. I think what also gets really interesting is I heard a talk from a vice president of General Electric describing that they've just set up in Louisville, Kentucky, their first demonstration of a facility where they have a lot of 3D printers and robotic manufacturing, but it's really designed for a consumer to just walk in and say, I want a new coffee pot and coffee maker, and then you can design it. And essentially they'll 3D print it for you there on demand, and you walk out with it. And basically what this guy was saying was that he thinks the days of the big centralized manufacturing facility and the assembly line and then having to ship tons of materials to one place and then ship tons of products out are over. That 3D printing and robotics means we will start. It may take a while, but that we will get to a point of much more decentralized production of those goods. So it will still have the issue of deliveries to homes, but the production side of it may be decentralizing as well. So lots more one could think about with all of these topics. So automation is kind of who knows whether any of us will have jobs. Actually, I don't want to end on that note. But I mean, there was a time, I remember when I was in high school, there was a futurist who was saying, robots means we'll all have the 3-day work week and life will be wonderful when everybody gets the 3-day work week. So, instead, right now, most people are panicked at the thought of automation taking away so many jobs. And I share that concern, but I'd love to think maybe more of us need to have more of a social movement to really, let's push for that universal 3-day work week. And so I'll end with that.
So just want to say thank you so much, Professor Ellen Dunham-Jones, for today's webinar. We really appreciate your time coming out and talking to everyone. We really appreciate everyone for staying on the line and working through the initial technical challenges, and we really appreciate your support. We'll be having 3 more of these webinars throughout the year. Please check the dates on our website, and thank you again for coming today and listening in.